You two maybe right here. Actually, let's go on to you guys. I'll get that. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here on this gloomy day. But it's going to be an exciting day in here. My name is Dorian Stuber, and I teach at Hendrix College. I'm also a member of the talent committee of the Six Bridges Literary Festival. And I'm delighted to see you here, whether in person or virtually, for what I know is going to be a really stimulating hour with our guests, Lan Samantha Chang and Oscar Hokeah. Want to quickly thank tireless festival director Brad Moy and his team, and I want to thank Wordsworth Books, who are one of our local indies, who place dear to my heart. They're selling copies of these and all the festival books. The authors will be signing their books outside the hall here afterwards. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that we are sitting on the ancestral homelands of the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw peoples, who were forcibly removed from this area through so-called treaties in 1818 and 1824. In the 1830s, Little Rock was a major stopping point on the Trail of Tears, the death march that followed the forced removal of Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole from their homelands in Florida. Those people would have marched along Broadway and Main Streets, right near where we sit now, or arrived by barges, and they would have assembled on the banks of the Arkansas River to be taken to their final destination. Later, 6 bridges would be built over these banks. As we marvel at these feats of engineering that connect us from shore to shore and give this literary festival its name, let us also stand in reverence and respect of those native peoples before those bridges that we cannot see, the personal, familial, and spiritual ties that bound those native peoples to their land and that continue to bind their descendants. We acknowledge that our grounding here today is that in this place is a result of the repeated destruction of those unseen bridges, and we pledge, in whatever ways are meaningful and possible for us, to work at rebuilding them. Let me introduce our writers today, and then they're going to read briefly from their works, and then we're going to have a conversation together. Lan Samantha Chang grew up in a smallish town in Wisconsin, a place perhaps not so different from the location of her latest novel, The Family Chao. She's the author of 2 previous novels and a short story collection. She's won all sorts of awards, a Stegner Fellowship, grants from the NEA and the Guggenheim Foundations. I was interested to learn from some serious Wikipedia research that she has a master's in public accounting from the Kennedy School at Harvard, and no doubt she relies on the things that she learned there in her current job as the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. I'm sure those writers are hard to wrangle. The Family Chao was one of President Obama's summer reading picks and apparently was a recent clue on Jeopardy! So I would say that counts as making it. Oscar Hokeah lives in Oklahoma, where he grew up, specifically in 2 communities that are central to his writing, Tahlequah and Lawton. He is a citizen of Cherokee Nation and the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma from his mother, and has Mexican heritage from his father, who emigrated from Aldama, Chihuahua, Mexico. He studied at the Institute of American Indian Arts and then the University of Oklahoma, also winning various awards. Calling for a Blanket Dance is his first book. In addition to his writing, he works with Indian child welfare in Oklahoma, experience that doubtless inspired some of the most moving sections of his novel. Now, we'll say that novel came out too late to be on Obama's list this year, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see it there next year, and I'm sure the Jeopardy clue will follow. Okay, so if you would join with me in welcoming our writers, I'd be grateful. And I wanted to ask each of you to read briefly from the books, and then we'll chat about them, take audience questions and stuff like that. And unfortunately, we were not clever enough to decide who should go first, so I'll just make an executive decision. Samantha, since I introduced you first, are you okay to start us off?
Sure. Okay, I'm going to read the first 2 pages of my novel, which I would describe as not only a literary caper, but a restaurant succession drama. set in a Chinese American community in the Midwest. For 35 years, everyone supported Liu Chao's restaurant, introducing choosy newcomers by showing off some real Chinese food in Haven, Wisconsin, bringing children, parents, grandparents, not wanting to dine out with the Americans, not wanting to think about which fork to use. You could say the manifold tensions of life in the new country, the focus on the future, tracking incremental gains and losses, were relieved by the fine Chao, sitting down under the dusty red lanterns, gazing at Leo's latest calendar with the limp-haired Taiwanese sylphs that Winnie hated so much. Everyone felt calm. In dark times, when you're feeling homesick or defeated, there is really nothing like a good steaming soup and dumplings made from scratch. Winnie and Big Liu Chao were serving scallion pancakes decades before you could find them outside of a home kitchen. Leo, 35 years ago, winning his first poker game against the owners of a local poultry farm, exchanged his chips for birds that Winnie transformed into the shining, chestnut-colored duck dishes of far-off cities. Dear Winnie, rolling out her bing the homemade way, 2 pats of dough together with a seal of oil in between, letting them rise to a steaming bubble in the piping pan. Leo, bargaining for hard-to-get ingredients. Winnie, subbing wax beans for yard-long beans, plus home-growing the garlic, greens, chives, and hot peppers you used to never find in Haven, their garden giving off a glorious smell. You could say the community ate its way through the Chao family's distress, not caring whether Winnie was happy, whether Big Chao was an honest man. Everyone took in the food on one side of their mouths, and from the other side they extolled the parents for their sons' accomplishments, heaping praise upon the 3 boys who grew up all bright and ambitious, who earned scholarships to good colleges, commending them for leaving the Midwest. Yet everyone was thankful when the oldest, Dago Chao, returned to Haven. Dago, coming home to his mother, moving into the apartment over the restaurant, working there 6 days a week. Dago, the most passionate cook in the family. Despite the trouble between Winnie and Big Chao, everyone assumed the business would be handed down fairly, peacefully, father to son. Now, a year after the shame, the intemperate and scandalous events that began on a winter evening in Union Station, the community defends its 35-year indifference to the Chao family's troubles by saying, "No one could have believed that such good food was cooked by a bad person."
Thank you. You know, the descriptions of food in this book are just really mouth-watering, so it's good that you tempered it in your choice. Thanks, Oscar.
Yes. Oh, thank you guys for having me. Thank you, Samantha, for that. That was amazing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read from a chapter that's toward the middle of the book. It's chapter 5, and it's Quentin Quitone's chapter. At this point in the novel, the main character, Geimausaddle, he is 18 years old, and him and his cousin Quentin are just getting what we call in Native community a per cap. So a per cap is a sum of money that you would get from the tribe. And every tribe is different. Some tribes don't get per caps at all. Kiowas, we got 1 per cap, and this was way back in, it initially started back in 1976 is when we sold land to Fort Sill military base, and the Kiowa tribe divided our portion between all tribal members. So if you were under 18, which I was at that time, then your money was held in trust and it grew interest until you turned 18, and then you got your per cap. And so these are 2 18 young guys who are just got a big lump sum of money, and they get a little bit ridiculous. I'm only going to read the first 2 pages, just a little snippet of it, just so you can get a sense of the voice. But they get a little wild with that money as you go into the chapter. But here we go. Quentin Quitone, 1993. Yeah, we were just little guys, around a year old, when Kiowa started getting that Hokeah. Back in 76, no, maybe in 77. It was a coalition of Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches that leased the tract of land of Fort Sill military base for 100 years. Good thing, too, because us Kiowas divided our share of the money between all tribal members, 1,500 apiece. Those of us under the age of 18 had our money held in trust, growing interest until our day. We were the last in our families to hear our mothers say, "Your per cap check is on the table." My birthday landed 2 months before yours. On your day, you burst into a laughing fit, and I told you, "Ever, calm yourself down, guy." On my day, I simply said, "Your boy Quentin just got paid," and I maintained all the way into the bedroom. But we both tore into those envelopes faster than the last meat pie on a plate, ripped out those stiff government checks, too. Remember the Statue of Liberty imprint in the upper left corner? Remember the line of numbers in the center right? Mine was $9,826.17. The hot off the press scent from that crisp paper hit us like the cool wall of air when we walked into the Bank of Oklahoma. Might know, the lady behind the counter did the same to you as she did to me. She glanced from the check to our face and back to the check again, tapping those red plastic fingernails on the counter. Her eyes barely squinted when she asked us how we managed to get our hands on that kind of money. You told her the tribe wanted us to help neglected bank tellers buy bleach for untreated roots. I had a permanent grin that no one would spoil, so I asked her if she dated Kiowas, and she said no. So I asked her if she dated Comanches, and she said no. So I asked her if she dated Cherokees, and she said no. Guess I was out of luck, because I was all out of tribes. We waved at the bank teller as we pushed open the doors. That ma bank pretended to not notice. Still, even she couldn't ignore the $6,000 in a checking account or the $4,000 in our pockets. I'll stop there. Thank you.
It's a great chapter because they keep coming back to the bank, right? So it's terrific. And the boys are cousins, is that right?
They are.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So and it kind of leads me into the first thing that I wanted to ask both of you, and then we'll see what folks in the audience want to chat about. But the importance of family in both of the novels, right? And it's there in the title of your book, Samantha, and it's there in the family tree at the beginning of yours, Oscar. I do love a family tree at the beginning of a book. And so I guess I would like you each to reflect on the meaning of family in these novels, and perhaps even in your life. Because you both write about, quote unquote minorities in a largely white America. I wonder if you think that family is like a refuge from dominant cultural expectations, or if you think it's a hindrance to the possibility of being accepted, if that's even a goal, or if you think it's something else altogether. I'm a professor, so I have lots of questions that go together. Like, is family synonymous with community? How big does family get before it starts losing its meaning? And the last thing I was wondering about in relation to family is if you think of your books as part of any literary kinds of like families as well. So just thoughts of different kinds of points of entry here. Obviously, it's not like a series of questions you have to answer one by one, but just your reflections on family and what that has meant to each of these books. Who wants to start?
I can start. My microphone's up here. So I guess family is I guess it is, like for everyone, just a source of heal. It can be a source of healing, and then also like connections to larger families, and especially like cultural dynamics. I guess when I think of family myself, I think of the families I'm tied into. Like on my Cherokee side, I'm a stop. I use that in the novel, so I would say I'm a part of the stop family. So if you're in the community and we're talking to each other, like if I'm talking to another Cherokee, and I'll mention, well, I'm a stop, and then they'll immediately know, like, oh, okay, I know your uncle or your cousin or whoever. They'll immediately associate to who I'm associated with. So in that context, like the family connections that I have, are tied to like this broader concept of family, not necessarily like a nuclear, necessarily just a nuclear family, but this extended family throughout the community. So the same thing happens on my Kiowa side as well. So like I'm a Hokeah, but I'm also related to Tashaquas and Quitones. And so if I'm talking to somebody, then I might bring that up, just so they know who I'm associated with. But on my Kiowa side as well, like we have what we call societies. And so societies are the cultural groups that keep cultural practices and customs and rituals alive. Like they organize events, I guess you could say. So like I would tell someone, I'm a Hokeah, I'm also related to Tashaquas, and I might name some family members, but I'd also go, we're tied to the Kiowa Type A, which is a society of ours, which is a very old society. And I might say, and then I have family who are with the Comanche Little Ponies and the Comanche War Scouts. And so when I say that, then they immediately know all, like within the community, Kiowa Comanche community, exactly who I'm connected to. So whenever I think of family, I think of that, that element, that kind of connectedness, the larger connectedness outside of the nuclear family. But also, when you ask the question about, does it become something of a refuge, with like larger societal pressures on tribal members. I think that sometimes because of historical trauma, we have issues that we have to deal with within the community that exists. So to a certain degree, we're dealing with that trauma, but the culture that we're tied to because of the family is also a part of the healing solution of for that trauma that we experience.
So primarily sustaining then feels like when if you're sustained by that larger family, you don't it allows you to anchor yourself and identify yourself in a way, and it's not like, oh God, everybody knows who I am all the time. That make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, like small town type politics. I mean, there's definitely that. Like, there's no secrets. You know what I mean? Like everybody knows your business, and you just and that's kind of like almost like a tribal justice type of lens as well. It's like if something negative is going to happen, then the whole community needs to know. We know, so we have some accountability. We start the healing process. We move past it. But if you're keeping secrets, then you can't. It's almost impossible to heal. So there's positive elements to everybody knowing your business.
Yeah,
but yeah,
that's interesting. And I feel it's interesting in your novel, Samantha, because secrets are so important in that book.
Yeah, I mean, by community, I'm thinking when you're talking about the community, my novel has a community narrator. The Chinese Americans in this town all kind of know each other's business, but they don't know the secrets of this particular family. And in some ways, I would say one of the lines in the story is the gradual revelation of the family secrets to the outer community around it, and how that affects not only the community, but the way they're seen by the world at large, which in this case would include the Caucasian members of their town, who are the majority, and also the internet. Like the story sort of spreads beyond family boundaries into the world. Thinking about all of your questions, I don't think I can answer all of them because they're so profound and far-reaching, but I was thinking of the way in which in Chinese American societies, in Chinese American families, there's often a slight conflict between the way that family is viewed in traditional Chinese society and the way that family is seen and the individual, as opposed to the individual, are seen in the U.S. So in traditional Chinese societies, you are born into your family and that is your primary allegiance. And you are part of this group. So that your individual sort of wants, desires, needs, interests are sort of subjugated to those of the family at large. And it's just understood that you will make sacrifices for your family, that is your major job, is to be part of your family. In the United States, however, there's an emphasis on individuality, this idea of becoming yourself, becoming independent. Psychological health is viewed as separation and individuation, and that includes, that's basically saying individuate from the parents, or they say the mother, but basically family. I think that in my book, the three sons of Liu Chao all deal with this idea of separating from family in different ways. And it's partly because they're maybe 5 or 6 years apart each, and they're born at different points in their parents' lives. So Dago, the oldest, is born at a time when his parents come to the US and they have very strong desires and goals for him to be like this shining star, the big reason that they sacrificed other lives and came to this country, and he's gonna make them all proud. And so he grows up with this feeling that he has to do something great and grand, and he does fail at this. And his parents are not happy with him. Being the middle child, grows up feeling sort of slighted and also feeling, I think, this pressure from the surrounding culture, that he's not really fitting in. And so he becomes somebody who wants to leave his family behind and become a true, quote, American, which for him means going to New York, making a ton of money, and just never coming back home for any particular holidays, like just being really independent. He's going to be an American, push all of the ideas of family behind. And then James, the youngest child, he's just trying to be a good son. He's sort of buying into the Chinese idea of obeying your parents, pleasing people, getting along. But James is actually in many ways further from China than the other children because he doesn't actually speak Chinese anymore. He was raised at a point when his parents had been in the US for so long that their English was pretty good, and his big brothers brought him up and spent all of their time hanging out with him and teasing him and doing all these things in English. And so he's kind of lost touch to a certain extent by the time the book starts, when he's about 19.
Yeah.
So I think that for this particular Chinese American family is a place where you go to be yourself and where everybody knows you. It's your home. But on the other hand, there's this very strong social pressure to emerge from the egg and become like your own man.
Yeah, right. Those are both really interesting answers. And the question of like what's sustaining and what's fraught, and the sort of like the way that's woven together in both books, really interesting. I have lots of other things I want to ask these writers, but I'd like to give the chance to you all first. What questions do you have? There's a couple mics set up, and so I think the idea is that you could approach the mic and ask your question. You can raise your hand too, but these lights are really bright. I might not see you very well. So what would you like to ask our writers?
So thank you both for being here, first of all. There was a virtual session for the festival a couple days ago with Ann Patchett and Elizabeth McCracken. And Ann said something that I thought was very provocative, and I wasn't sure whether or not I agreed with it. What she talked about was how, as a young writer, she was doing her best to ignore what she thought the expectations of the wider readership might be, and trying to write into her art. She resisted the idea that she needed to kind of appeal to the broadest possible audience. And as she had grown older, and as she had become a bookseller, she had become more and more attuned to the pleasures of satisfying her customers, basically, with her books. And I wasn't sure what to make of this, because a lot of the books I love best probably wouldn't exist if they weren't willing to satisfy the aesthetic of the 200 readers who happen to appreciate them, I being one of them. But what I'm interested in, I suppose, is to what extent, when you're writing your novels, you take into account what you imagine the desires of a wider readership might be, and to what extent you resist them, and whether that's changed over your careers as well, or whether you anticipated changing.
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I started out writing now 30 years ago. I was a baby writer, and I had a really strong sense that I had to write to my art, and particularly to write to the people that mattered to me and not to the larger readership, and as represented by one of my earliest readers, actually, when I started studying writing and went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, Frank Conroy said, "Don't write about Chinese Americans." And it was his one piece of advice to me, and I think it was really well meant. I think he had my interests at heart, because he said that if I wrote about only Chinese Americans, then I would not have a wider readership, and that people would pigeonhole me. He literally said they will pigeonhole you as, a writer of this kind of thing. But at the time, I felt so strongly that I had to be true to myself, and the only characters that I felt like I could really write about in that, heartfelt, intense, truthful way were Chinese American. And I think that over the years that has changed as I have changed. First of all, my family has moved further and further from their point of origin in this country. My parents are both now deceased, and I think in many ways am quite American. And that is one of the subjects of this recent book. I mean, the characters ask themselves, for how long are we immigrants if our parents are dead? If the people who came from the other country are dead, how long, are we still immigrants now? But I feel, I don't think that I think about a readership at large. It may change with this book because no one's ever really approved of my work before. Now that I know that President Obama actually was sitting in a chair reading my book, I feel kind of wow. If I write another book, maybe he'll read that too. So there's there's an audience, But really, I can't write at all if I think about other people. I can only write by digging into my own private woes or interests or passions, and I can't even tell myself when I'm working on a book that anyone's going to read it. I have to tell myself that it's going to be a failure and no one will read it, and that's the only way I can get work done on it. So each of my books has been kind of an impossible project. After that first book, each one has been impossible for one reason or another. This last one was impossible because it's really trying to write an homage to one of the greatest books of world literature, The Brothers Karamazov, is impossible. And so I just sort of assumed the whole time I was writing it that it would never see the light of day, and that's the only way I can get work done on it. So if I start thinking about the wider audience, I may not get any work done at all.
Yeah, I guess for me it's similar as far as when I sit down to write, that I'm drawing from personal experience, and that's kind of given me the motivation to keep going. And I think that to a certain extent I'm trying to do a certain level of advocacy for these tribally specific communities, and some of the challenges we have, and the solutions that we have for that historical trauma. And so I guess because of that, I do write in that very kind of specific way, and maybe I am writing for an audience of one when I'm writing. But I think that, I do have in the back of my mind that I want readers to connect with the story. And I think what transfers is that while I'm very specific to the families that I grew up with in the Cherokee community, the families that I grew up with in the Kiowa community, and you see that in Geimausaddle's storyline, it's very specific as well. It plays out in a similar way that my life played out. And but I think that the thing that transfers is, what I've seen is that the more specific I get, I see a lot of people relating to the characters. The more specific, the more universal it becomes. With that piece that I read with Geimausaddle and Quentin Quitone when they get the per cap money, and some of the antics that they go through. I've had people who were not Native at all come up to me and say, "Yeah, I remember when I was 18 and we had this big party, and this guy he went streaking through the neighborhood and I couldn't get him to put his clothes back on." And so they've had wild experiences too when they were young. And so it makes it relatable like that. Like these are young guys that are getting a little reckless. And so they can relate in that sense. And but I think that one of the elements that transfers as well to a broader audience is I think that the novel Geimausaddle was a part of the working class, so I feel like the novel is very much like an homage to the working class, and it depicts our lives. And I grew up in poverty, grew up in a working poor environment, and it captures our lives without judgment. Like this is the way we exist. This is how we've struggled to survive. Culturally, these are some of the ways that we've tried to negotiate that space, and so it depicts like Geimausaddle's life and his family in a non-judgmental way. But so in a broader context, like I think working class, if you identify with that environment, you'll very much get a lot out of the book. But even broader than that, because we're talking about the human condition and the human experience, that when I sit down to write, I'm personally looking for an emotional connection. Like whenever I'm writing, I want to be in an emotional state. So there's, moments in the novel that are going to tug at your heartstrings, and if you start crying in the novel, that's because whenever I was writing it, I started crying. So I think because of, or if you laugh while you're reading the book, that's because I laughed when I was writing it. And I think because of those kinds of emotional spaces that I create, and I try to get into that kind of mind space, that transfers over to broader audiences as well. So, but that's something I'm always mindful as I'm writing. So how can I evoke frustration? How can I evoke anger? How can I evoke sadness, laughter, like the whole gamut of the human emotion. And I say this all the time, but oftentimes I feel like I'm most human when I'm writing, because I can be vulnerable. I can be all of myself all the time when I write. Whereas when I'm out walking in the world, I have to be guarded about, who's going to judge me this way or that way. But when I'm writing, I don't have to do that. So because of that, I'm able to transfer that kind of emotional state, and I think that would speak to a broader audience.
That dynamic of the particular that paradoxically lets you be more universal or wider ranging. It's thinking about this in terms of the specificity of cultural references in both books, whether it be in terms of certain kinds of foods. I mean, I know some of the foods in this book. I don't know all of them. And there are a lot of words in your novel, Oscar, like that are in Spanish or that are indigenous languages. I assume Cherokee and Kiowa. I don't even know. And there's in neither case is there any effort to kind of like translate that in some way. It's like figure it out, right? Or that difference is important to recognize as foreignness or difference in some way. So I wondered if, on a practical level, if either of you received any kind of like pushback from editors or agents or whatever, or also just more generally like your thoughts about using that kind of specificity in your writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So back when I was a baby writer, there was an idea that that the reading public was essentially ignorant of the community I was writing about, and that there was this belief that among some writers that they needed to explain certain words or things that they were using, ideas that they were sort of describing, even images, to, quote, the reader. But I think at this point, I think people understand that the reader is not necessarily, like to write for an assumed reader from the dominant culture changes what is being written. Mm-hmm. And so now I think that what people are doing is trying to write without assuming that their reader is from the dominant culture. I've seen this in the work of my students, many of whom write books with, for example, Asian characters in them or foreign languages in that they're just assuming that the, sort of formerly known as dominant culture reader is not going to understand. I think it's, for me, again, because my writing comes from such a private place, I don't want to explain anything I'm doing to anyone, and I just want to write about what exists within that space, what matters to me. And so I really, I feel like putting in, dishes that people may not have eaten, for example, or words that they may not know, And just not explaining them is fine. People understand what they're going to understand. When I grew up, I think one of the books I read over and over was A Separate Peace. My daughter's reading it now for high school, so I was thinking about it. And I was thinking about the way that I had never been to prep school. You know, I'd never been a boy in prep school and done all of the things that these boys do and the rituals that they know. But I had absorbed the book and understood the book because of the specificity of the details.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with everything Samantha had said. And so in my book, you used, like you had mentioned, so there are characters that are Cherokee, and so whenever they're telling the story, Cherokee words, Cherokee phrases just pop in, and I don't explain anything. There are characters who are Kiowa, and they'll do the same thing. Characters who are Mexican Americans or Spanish will pop in, mixed in with English. And so I'm, very much interested in how language changes and how per community, and these community-specific areas, how language can be played with and developed in a very unique way. So I'm, interested in colloquial speech. So not only do I use Cherokee, but I use Cherokee slang, and I use Kiowa slang, Spanish slang as well. So I'm looking at the evolution of language and how languages influence each other, and then they change. So English language, it has a ton of words that are indigenous words, and a lot of people don't know that they're indigenous words. And so, so I'm interested in that dynamic, and so you see it play out in the novel as well. But I don't, I don't explain those moments. So whenever Geimausaddle's grandmother, Lena Stopp, is speaking, she's just going to throw in a Cherokee phrase or a Cherokee word, and leave it up to context. Like in the context of it, you can kind of get the gist. And like Samantha had mentioned, I've read a ton of books where I haven't exactly experienced what I've been reading personally, but I very much identified with some of the emotional elements that they were going through. Maybe I was maybe the same age, and so and identify with that aspect. Something connected me to the work. So I feel like that also transfers into my writing as well. While I don't explain these situations, and even with some of the traditional stories, like I'll reference the two characters I mentioned before, Geimausaddle, Quentin Quitone. Family members will call them Sun Boys. And so in Kiowa culture, the Sun Boys are a specific traditional story. There's a traditional story that goes along with the Sun Boys. So if you're Kiowa and you say, oh, they're like Sun Boys, then they go, oh, okay, they immediately know the story. They immediately understand how Ever and Quentin are Sun Boys. And then there's no need for explanation for Kiowa people, but for people outside of the Kiowa community, even for other tribes, they might not completely understand. But there might be a reference, like there might be something in their own personal scope that would give them something of a sense of what's going on. But you can seek it out. Like you can look. In this day and age, you can Google, YouTube, just about everything. So you just take it out of the book, put it in the Google machine, and then see what pops up. So I don't. For that reason, I don't get specific. I don't explain.
Yeah, and do you think in a way that it would be a little bit like talking down to the reader to explain it to them? It's like, well, you don't know this, but I'm going to explain this to you, so that they don't actually get as authentic an experience of another culture, if they're being explained to all the time.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree with that.
Yeah, the context, absolutely, you can totally kind of get the gist, but I think the certain kind of foreignness as a reader, I like it. That sense of like, I'm peeking through at something, but it's maybe not quite for me, and I think that's, I don't know, it seems valuable to me, right? So
it's valuable in the same way that I enjoyed learning about boys in prep school when I was 15.
Right.
I learned a lot.
Yeah, anthropological kind of quality there, right? Yeah. What other questions do you all have?
This is for Samantha. I noticed you dedicated your book to James Allen McPherson, and I know that he was at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, won the Pulitzer Prize. How did he influence your writing?
Thanks for that question. So James Allen McPherson, one of the great underrated, I think, American writers of the 20th century, winner of a Pulitzer Prize and a MacArthur Fellowship, one of the first MacArthur geniuses, is a writer that nobody is reading right now. Not nobody, but like very few people are reading Jim's work, and it's extraordinary work. I have theories about why people are not reading it. One is that Jim was not at all a person who was into PR. He just never boasted. He was extraordinarily humble. And he didn't do anything to get his book out there. Like, if he were alive now and he died in 2016, he would not be on Twitter. Well, he might be a lurker. He would want to know what everyone was saying, just as when we were in Iowa City, when I was a student there and he was my teacher, he would subscribe to all these right-wing publications and things just because he felt like it was important to know what was going on out there. Jim was born in Georgia during the time of Jim Crow. He came of age during the civil rights movement, and eventually he went to Harvard Law School after attending a historically black college in Atlanta, Morris Brown, it's one of the consortium of colleges in Atlanta now, but it's just getting back on its feet after having kind of gone out of business for a little while. He did really well in college, went to Harvard Law School, and when he was there, started writing these extraordinary stories, some of the most amazing stories. One of them is Gold Coast. I highly recommend Gold Coast. He wrote a lot about porters, black porters working on trains, because he spent his summer vacation working through summer for school on trains. And he was just the most warm, like kind, humble, gentle, intelligent person that I've ever studied with. And he was very encouraging to all of us who were trying to do strange things. Like, when I was at the program, everyone was trying to write like Raymond Carver at the time, but he was a big proponent of ghost stories, and stories based on legends. And I really think that in some low-key way, because he hardly ever talked in class, he was one of the biggest influences on my writing from the very beginning in so many ways. And he definitely influenced the Family Chao, because of the main character, Leo Chao, is kind of a crass person, and I know Jim would have laughed at his jokes. Jim would have thought he was hilarious. And I thought about him a little bit when I was, moving. I'm sure that he was I don't know if they consciously thought about it, but sometimes you have a teacher who gets into your bloodstream so much that you don't even think about them personally. They're like a voice in your mind. Yeah, so he was an incredible, incredible influence on me. And we're lucky that in Iowa City that he was there for more than 20 years, and we've now named a park after him. And, students go to visit his grave on a regular basis. It's an extremely hospitable gravesite where there's like a bench where you can sit. And I don't know, I'm just going on about Jim. He's really kind of a special person.
Hue and Cry, it's back in print, and Hue and Cry is back in print, his collection.
Hue
So
and Cry.
you could probably order it from your local independent bookstore.
Yeah, Elbow Room.
Great. Other questions?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I just had a question about place. It's interesting to me that both of your novels are set in sort of flyover America, and so I was curious whether or not there was something you discovered about that sort of invisibility, the sort of invisibility of sort of the middle part of the country, and just where do you see that coming through in your work or in the novels?
I think that's one of the things that I, definitely wanted to bring attention to. I mean, like you mentioned, Oklahoma, or this part of the United States doesn't get a ton of attention in different kinds of media. But I think that to a certain extent plays to our advantage in that people haven't heard our stories to a certain degree, and I'm all about specificity, like hyper local environments for every writer. And I'm a proponent of regionalism, like I talk about being a regionalist writer. I think there's a lot to be discovered, if we think of ourselves in those kinds of in that kind of lens. But also if we think of ourselves as writers in that family-specific kind of lens, where you draw on your own personal dynamics within your own friend group, your family group, your community group, and how unique it is, even when compared to maybe another family group that might be in the same region, the same area, in order to create it even a more kind of I feel like it's a richer experience the more specific you get, the more hyper-local you get. But I think, Oklahoma, it's home to 39 different tribes. A lot of people don't know that there's that many tribes. There's more languages spoken in Oklahoma than the entire continent of Europe. And people don't know that as well. And so with my novel, with myself being half Kiowa and Cherokee, half Mexican, half Native, and moving between those spaces, and the main character moves between two different tribal groups, Kiowa and Cherokee, we get a sense of the unique qualities of every individual tribe. And so I think that was definitely a place was on my mind for that reason, that sometimes when we think of Native Americans, we're thinking of a broader kind of understanding of indigenous people. And sometimes we think of natives as being a single homogenous group, and we are brought together under a shared colonial history. But we also have unique individual qualities about every tribe. Every tribe speaks its own language. Every tribe has its own rituals and customs. Even if a tribe sits next to another tribe and has a lot of similarities, like Kiowas, Comanches, we have a lot of similarities. We're Southern Plains. But like Comanches have a clan system, Kiowas don't. And we have completely different language systems that aren't related at all. So there's these different elements, even if tribes sit right next to each other, that distinguish the differences between the two. And so in the book, I do a lot of that work, where Geimausaddle, he's negotiating Cherokee spaces, and then he goes to the Southern Plains, where he's negotiating Kiowa and Comanche spaces, and what the cultures kind of look like in those two different locations. But yeah, I think that does, I think people are interested in learning about Middle America. And I think Oklahoma being, because I was born and raised there, I could speak to a lot of those kind of intertribal dynamics.
I was born in Wisconsin, and I now live in Iowa. I've lived in the Midwest for more years of my life than I've lived anywhere else. And I just think people who aren't in the Midwest are kind of ignorant. No, I love the fact that it's this fascinating and rich place with wonderful places to live and cool things, people making great art, that so many of the great writers in our culture have come from these places, these sort of quote-unquote flyover places. And yet the people on the coast don't seem to know about them. I don't know. I love secrets, and I feel like setting this novel in the Midwest felt really good to me because it felt real to me and sort of private.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, yes, I'm a historian, but I get a lot of inspiration from fiction writers, so thank you so much for your work. And I'm wondering if both of you can talk a little bit about your writing practice, about how you write and when and where, and if the pandemic really changed that for you, and in what ways?
Okay, I'll go. With my process, it's changed over the years. So way back when I was first started writing, I guess when for most of the time that I was writing up until about 2009 or so, 2010, I was like one of those writers who wake up every day at 5 and write for, a certain amount of hours, write till 10, stop at 10, wake up the next day, do the same thing over and over every day. And And then I hit a block. So about 2010, between 2010 and 2012, I wasn't sure what I was, if I was going the right direction, a lot of self-doubt, and I just stopped writing. I just couldn't do creative writing. I could do academic writing because I was in grad school at that time, but I couldn't do creative writing. There was some kind of mental block there.
Maybe it was maybe it was the relationship.
Well,
between
I
grad
wish I could say that, but it started right before I went.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I wish I could blame it on OU.
It's a safe bet to blame all bad things on graduate school, I would say. So yeah.
No, but it did have like the semester before I went to grad school, but I just wasn't confident in my direction, even though the earliest chapters in this novel were written at that time, and they're very distinctive. But so because of the block, it altered the way I approached my writing because I had to adapt. And so I came back into it again in 2012, and then wrote for a few more years, got same kind of thing, lost confidence. I went to 2 more years of a block, like just didn't write nothing for 2 years again, and then came out of it. And because whenever I would come out of those situations, I would feel, suddenly inspired, and I would write a lot of content in a short amount of time. So now, these days, it more mirrors that kind of environment where I might go a month or so where I'm not really writing a ton, but then I feel like, and this has happened in the last few weeks where, okay, I'm gonna get back into the writing. I can feel like my mind moving into that space, and I'll write a little bit every day, and then I'll have a few days where I'll just write a ton of content. Like I'll write like 5,000 words a day, and it just kind of all comes out. And then I might, after those few days, then it kind of goes back to where I might be just writing a little bit here and there throughout the day, and just kind of staying in that mind space, knowing that at some point I'll do it again. Like I'll have this 2-3 day period where I'm just like, everything's coming out quickly. And I think I write like that now because I had to like overcome the challenges of coming out of that block.
That's so interesting because you said that some of the earliest chapters of this were written when you were sort of in a blocked phase?
Before, yeah,
right before?
Yeah, so I had like Quit and Quito, the chapter I had read, that was my very first, that's the oldest chapter in this book, written in 2008. And then the second oldest is Hayes Shade's chapter in here, 2009. Very distinct voice, very clear. I'm Kiowa, Cherokee, intertribal, hyperlocal writer, but for some reason, being a young writer, I just wasn't sure if I would, should I go that direction? And I think it was just a kind of questioning that sent me that
That's
direction.
so interesting because also I wonder, okay, this is totally unrelated to what you just said, but what you said reminded me of this. This idea that when you're really writing about something that matters to you, that's right from your actual self, it makes you vulnerable, and so you lose confidence in it. I mean, am I right?
Yeah.
I feel like when you really try hard to write, that's when you get when you have the hardest time, because you're writing about something that really matters to you. I don't know, but I think it's interesting that right when you found the voice of this, you sort of paused or stopped. I don't know. Not that it's any of I also went through a period when I was writing every morning for 3 hours because Frank Conroy told me to do it, and it was one of the other best things he ever told me.
Yeah.
But then I had one kid caused like a kind of chaos in my writing that I've never really changed out of. I mean, I have 2 problems. One is my day job, which is directing the workshop, and 2 is having a child. And both of them interfere with my writing to a certain extent. Yeah. No offense to them, because they're very important to me both. And so I've had to I've also had to change over time to adapt my writing habits to the fact that I have other things going on in my life. Like, it was much easier when all I had to do was get up and write. And everything else was sort of secondary to writing. But now I'm in this position where I feel like no, other things are also important to me, or I feel responsible to them, and I can't drop the ball. And what I've done to sort of deal with that is after going through a really rough patch of not writing at all for almost 4 years,
Oh, wow.
I know it was so bad, I started going away from home and going to these residencies where you can spend a few weeks on your own in a room and somebody often feeds you, but even if no one's feeding you, you don't have to feed other people. And you can just think about your work. And I couldn't do this until my daughter was 7, and then I had a really great period of time where I would maybe twice a year go away, write, and she and her dad would hang out and do fun things without me. They now have this great relationship because I was gone. It's been great. It's worked because then I get enough of a start on it so that when I come home and I have all these other things going on, I can still get some done regularly because I feel like I've got something behind me.
Regrettably, we are just about at the end of our hour, and this is bumming me out a lot. But I was going to ask one more thing, but I won't ask it as a question. I'll kind of just say it and leave it for folks to think about, maybe, and for you guys to think about, which is what really struck me about both books, which are so wonderful, and I really encourage everyone to buy them and read them, is their generosity. And I'm thinking about this, like the amazing kind of meal that one character makes in your novel, Samantha, right? And it's like fantastic scene. And I'm thinking about how your main character, Oscar, takes in this troubled kid into his life, or how another character makes these amazing quilts, right? So it's kind of generous moments. And not just generous inside the books, but it feels like the books themselves are generous. I mean, even just your homage there to James McPherson, that was a really generous moment. And so what I wanted to know is whether you set out to write generous books, or if that's something that just kind of like happened along the way. But maybe that's something that we can chat about outside the hall here, where the writers will be available to sign the books. But I would, before we stop, ask you to join me once more in thanking Samantha Chang and Oscar Hokeah for their thoughtful presence here today. There's still lots more festival left. Please get out there and enjoy some of those other panels. And thanks again to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.